Thanks, Bob. What I'm going to do in my talk is really give you a quick recap about the Representative Areas Program and the 2003 zoning. I want to talk about some of the new information that's become available and some of the lessons we've learned since the rezoning. And I'll finish off by talking about some of the possible implications of that information for a future rezoning sometime down the track. We've been hearing a fair bit about the zoning the last few days. I don't need to tell you much about that. Just to remind you that it came into effect in 2004. But I'm assuming that not everyone in the room was here when we went through the process of designing the program, so you mightn't have seen this sort of schematic before. Effectively, this is an outline of what we went through to get to the rezoning. And the first part really had a fundamental scientific underpinning. Some of you in the room were heavily involved in developing the map of bioregions, which was a really important cornerstone of the rezoning. And some of you also helped us develop the planning principles. Some of you also got involved in providing submissions, either in the first phase that helped us develop the draft, or commenting on the draft and helped us develop the final plan. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is the map of bioregions, and I want to stress this was the best available science available to us in the time we were doing it, and we've learned a lot since then. But this map of 70 bioregions was a really fundamental underpinning of the Representative Areas Program. Similarly important were the principles that we developed or had developed with our scientific advisory committees. So we had 11 biophysical principles and 4 socioeconomic management principles. I won't go through them in detail, but I'll just bring your attention to 2. The minimum of 20% per bioregion was a principle that many people focused on and was an important one for our final network. And another one I want to bring your attention to was a principle, again, that talked about we should include whole reefs in each no-take zone or not have split zoning. Very quickly, I just want to use an area off Townsville to sort of take you through a case study. So this is the reef bioregions in the area of Townsville. This is the non-reef bioregions for that same area. And as I said, that level of information was a really important basis for us to develop our network. And so the final 2003 zoning plan, which came into effect in 2004, used that sort of underpinning, that sort of scientific basis, used the principles, used the submissions we got, and used our knowledge and our interaction with a wide range of stakeholders to come up with a network which effectively met our principles and achieved the objective, which was to protect the biodiversity, but to do it in a way which minimised the impact upon the users. So I now want to quickly talk about some of the more recent knowledge, and obviously, as I said, this is post-WRAP, and it's the sort of stuff we're going to have to consider if and when we do another zoning. This is the sort of work that Roland Pitcher and others were involved in from CSIRO, the seabed biodiversity. And if you look at that sort of level of knowledge and compare it to where we were with the original non-reef bioregions, you can see we've got a lot better knowledge about the non-reef. This is the extent of reefs that we had available to us when we did the zoning. This was spatially quite good. This was done from satellite imagery, but now we've got a lot better information. So that was the basis upon which the zoning was built for the reefs. But a lot of work done recently, particularly by Rob Beeman, in terms of bathymetry, in terms of looking at a wide range of information, but really getting much better knowledge about the reefs has helped us a lot. Rob has also done some amazing work in the areas outside the reefs in deep water. And again, this is really important for us in the future and providing all sorts of new knowledge that we had no idea of when we did the rezoning. Rob's also identified coral reefs that we didn't even know about. So this again is important new knowledge. And on top of that, the sort of work that Tom Bridge and Peter Harris and a whole lot of other people have been doing, looking at the mesophotic reefs and the shoals and the deeper areas, again, are really important. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, this basically doubles the extent of what we've talked about in terms of coral in the Great Barrier Reef in the past. We've also got work done by Geoscience Australia and people at JCU looking at some of these other more important features, particularly in the deeper water offshore, but also talking about things like some of these paleo channels inshore, which again are really important features from a point of view of outstanding universal value for the Great Barrier Reef. Tom Bridge and Alana have sat down and actually looked at all that sort of data and done an analysis. And effectively, they've looked at and described 34 habitats and assemblages, based largely, as I said, on the work done by Roland and Co., looking at the seabed biodiversity, but also a lot of that deep water stuff. And in having done that analysis and looked at the extent covered by the zoning, it turns out that most of those 34 habitats are reasonably well protected in marine national park zones. For example, the mesophotic reefs are over 30% protected, which is great. Even more exciting are some of these deep water features about which we had no knowledge at the time. So the canyons are 38% protected. In one of the assemblage areas, I think it's 80% protected. So we've done pretty well in a large proportion of those 34 habitats and assemblages that identified. But 5 have been identified in this analysis by Tom and Alana as being less than 20% protected. I've listed them there on the table. If we look at this one here, less than 14%, seagrass and algal habitat in the inner half near the southern Capricornian section. This one here is pretty close to 20%, but it's actually quite an important deep water area that is under pressure as well. These two assemblages here are very similar in the inshore, shallower inner shelf areas. And then the really one where we're not anywhere near our 20% is the deep water terraces. So that's just in green zones. It's important also to look at some of the other zones. For example, in this case, this assemblage has almost 30% in the habitat protection zone. So remember that zone is basically protecting the habitat, the benthos from dredging, those sorts of activities that don't affect the benthos. So we've got a fair bit of protection in that area, even though we haven't achieved the 20% in the green zone. Unfortunately, we haven't done particularly well in the other zones or these other areas. So as I said, the zoning we ended up with in 2003, it was the best political outcome we could get, the best sort of compromise. It wasn't perfect, and clearly adaptive management is required. But it basically met many of our principles. It didn't achieve them all, and I want to stress they were principles. They weren't targets, they weren't rules, but it met many of our principles. But most importantly, it provided far better protection for the Great Barrier Reef. So I think what's really nice is now to look at the network we developed using those principles, to put it on top of the new knowledge, the new species, the new records of habitats, and recognise we've done a pretty good job of protecting that as well. However, we can still improve. So if we overlay some of that new knowledge, and I reminded you before of the principle that talked about whole reefs within zones, clearly we've got some areas where we haven't achieved that particularly well. So again, we can improve and use that new knowledge. I want to now talk about another aspect of the zoning and use this area off Cape Bowling Green as an example. I think most people in the room understand how we've defined the zones. The zones are largely defined by latitude and longitude points that are easily looked at by GPS. And so offshore, people who are travelling out there with the GPS know where the zone boundaries are. Inshore, we try to use recognisable features, but again, the actual zone boundary legally is shown by a latitude and longitudinal point. This is an example also where we took on board the desires. Obviously, there was a real interest in fishing by local people along the Cape Bowling spit here, and so a yellow zone was left to allow people to do that. They could walk along the spit and fish. Clearly, we had an important area out here in the middle of Bowling Green Bay, which we wanted to protect by a green zone. However, one of the things we weren't quite aware of was the extent to which that spit actually moves. And so here's a classic example of how enforcement has to be a bit mindful that some of these features are a bit more transitory than we thought. So today that spit has actually moved from this position to actually the tip is actually in the green zone. And so we've had to remind users not to rely on the feature to identify where they are, to actually recognise that that has moved. The zone boundary hasn't changed. Legally, the zone boundary is where it is. And if they're at the end, they could well be in a green zone. So that's an example of how, as managers, we have to recognise we have to look perhaps more historic at some areas, but also we can't use these sort of features that are moving to help people identify local features and use that as a zone boundary. So I now want to talk about some of the things we need to think of as an agency for future zoning. Clearly, one day we're going to be faced with the zoning. Who knows when? That's clearly a call for the Minister of the day. Many people probably aren't aware, though, as a result of the 2004 zoning, there was a major political review. This ended up in a huge number of changes for this part of the Act. And so in 2006, the review led to, as I said, considerable changes. And so what we'd be required to do as an agency today is quite different in terms of zoning to what we had in 2003, 4, etc. So now, in law, GBRMPA is required, before preparing a zoning plan, to identify planning principles which must cover environmental, economic and social objectives. We must get those approved by the Minister, and they must be publicly available before we actually start the planning. We must also prepare a statement of environmental, economic and social values. Now, we're not sure whether something like the Outlook report is a good step towards this. We haven't actually done one, but it's a whole new requirement in law before we prepare a zoning plan. And again, that statement has to be publicly available. It's interesting also to look at the Act now in terms of what the objects of zoning are. The ones I've got on the board here are basically the same objects that existed in 1975 when the Act was first declared or first proclaimed. The wording has, however, been tweaked to be a bit more contemporary, but effectively each of those issues have been the long-term proposal for the Great Barrier Reef. It's sort of a multiple use, recognising its multiple use area, but the main objective is to protect the values of the Great Barrier Reef. So these are the legal objects for a new zoning, and you'll see words in there which, as I said, are new or contemporary interpretations, but the overall thrust is basically what zoning has always been about. I'll bring your attention to these last two: reserve some areas for public enjoyment, and the very last one, preserve some areas in a natural state, undisturbed except for scientific research that cannot be undertaken elsewhere. That's effectively the rationale for the preservation zones, but I'll come back to that one at the end of my talk. What we've also got now in the objects of zoning are some completely new and additional objects. And so in law now, there is a requirement to protect World Heritage values for the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area, not for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, for the World Heritage Area. World Heritage values is an evolving topic, but basically the way the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value has been written, it now includes some aspects of Indigenous heritage which must be considered when preparing the next zoning. And we're also required to provide for ecologically sustainable use of marine resources by traditional owners consistent with their traditional practices. So these are effectively new objects for zoning which we certainly didn't have facing us when we did the 2003 zoning plan. The law also now says after preparing a zoning plan, GBRMPA is required to prepare a statement looking at environmental, economic and social effects of the plan. Again, we did basically a regulatory impact statement last time, and we looked at some of the economic impacts, but this is much more a formal requirement in law. GBRMPA must also prepare a statement of how the principles were addressed, and this has got a time frame. Unlike the other ones, this has to be done within 60 days of the Gazette notice. I just want to quickly remind people, I think there's some confusion by some people in the room, what's the difference between the marine park and the World Heritage Area? So this diagram is down around Curtis Island. The marine park boundary is shown by that red line. So basically here, the marine park boundary is following low water. Out around islands, it's following low water. But the marine park boundary does not include internal waters, it doesn't include ports, and it doesn't include islands. There are some of the nearly 1,000 islands within the outer boundaries. There are about 70 that are Commonwealth Islands, but the majority of islands are state-owned. And so they are surrounded by the marine park. So that's the marine park boundary. If we think about the World Heritage boundary, it's a different boundary. It's low water mark here, but then it follows low water mark effectively along the mainland coast. The World Heritage Area also includes all the islands within that outer boundary. So it's important for people to recognise the marine park boundary and the World Heritage are slightly different. Okay, I mentioned pink zones before, and I'd like to sort of come back to this. When we did the when we did the 2003 zoning plan, we had a pink zone network that was basically the ones left over from the previous zoning, and we brought in a few extra ones. But effectively, compared to, say, the green zones, there was not the same level of rigour around how we developed them. So we do have a pink zone network. and under the analysis that Tom and Alana did, effectively 9 of the 34 habitats have no preservation zones, but the remaining ones do, which is great. However, the average size of a preservation zone is really tiny, and the area they cover is less than 1% of each of those habitat types. The extent basically is from minuscule to the biggest one, 0.9% of the habitat type. And the other point I would make, coming back to the objective of a preservation zone, I would really believe that the size and the distribution that we currently have is not sufficient to meet that objective. So that's a question I'd like to pose to people in this room, to AIMS. I've already spoken to Jamie about this as an issue. I think we need to think, if we are going to meet this objective of having something undisturbed, and clearly from Mark's comments this morning about boat noise and things, a tiny little preservation zone with boating all around it and green zones perhaps is not undisturbed by human influence. So I really think we need to look at the pink zone network as a challenge for a future zoning in the Great Barrier Reef. Just to finish off, I want you all to consider what you're doing and how what you're doing might feed into the next zoning. We've heard some amazing talks about a whole range of issues, and I think it's really important that we use that sort of knowledge to inform the future zoning, whenever that may be. So think about it. I'm more than happy if you want to have a chat to me. If I'm not around, any one of the GBRMPA people that are in the room would love to hear from you. But I'm sure there's a huge amount that we need to think about and use when we do a next zoning. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.